Hi and welcome. In this lesson, we are going to deep dive into how exactly internet works because we all use internet every day and we take it for granted. So before we start creating some beautiful website and web pages, let's first understand the fundamentals of how internet works. So what is internet? Well, a lot of people think it as a cloud which is hanging around in the sky, and it's super complicated and super complex. But in reality, it is very simple. So all it is a long piece of wire that connects different computers together. For instance, this computer can be present at London, and this computer, let's suppose it is present at India. So these two computers are connected with the help of internet. Okay. Okay. Now some of these computers attached to the internet have a special job. So they need to be ready 24 into 7 just to serve the client's request. Okay, so let's try to understand this diagram. So this is a server, and a server has a job that it needs to be ready 24 into 7, and it will just handle the client's request. So for example, let's say a client is requesting for a particular web page. So that request will go all the way around to the server via internet, and in response to that request, the server will respond with that particular page that the client has requested for. Okay, now in order to make this concept of client and server more clear to you, let's take an example. Okay, a real life example. So let's say we have a huge library. Okay, and inside that huge library, a client is visiting or a customer is visiting. Okay, so he demands for a book X. The name of the book is X. Now the library manager, what is the job of library manager? The library manager will search for that X book. Okay, and when he finds that book, so he will just give it to the customer. Okay, so the library manager is the server and the customer is the client. Okay, so here the customer demands for a particular book, and in response to that, the server or the library manager is going to search for that particular book and will return that book to the customer. Okay, now it has one drawback. So let's suppose there are n number of clients that are visiting per second. Okay, so that will make this process less optimized, and the speed will become a little bit slow. Okay, so in order to make it more optimized, what exactly happens, let's try to understand that with the help of this flow chart. Okay, so what is happening here is, this is the client. Okay, and the client is, let's suppose the client wants to visit to this google.com homepage. Okay, so the client will just open his or her browser and it will just type this whole URL inside the search bar. Okay, now what will happen, what is happening behind the scenes is this particular request will firstly go to the ISP. So ISP stands for Internet Service Provider. Okay, so for example, ISPs can be Geo, Airtel. So there are different types of internet service providers. So this request will go to the internet service provider. Now the internet service provider will send or will forward this request to the DNS server. Okay, so this DNS server is a kind of phone book. Okay, so what will happen, for a particular website, every website will have a unique IP address. Okay, so what will happen, this DNS server will find out the corresponding IP address to this particular URL. Okay, so after finding the corresponding IP address to that URL, the DNS server will return that IP address to back to the client. Okay, now client has the IP address and he or she will directly send the request to that particular IP address. Okay, so now what will happen, the client, after all this process, the client will have the IP address and he will send the request to that particular IP address. Now at that particular IP address there will be a server. Okay, so let's suppose we have a IP address, and on that particular IP address the client is sending some request. Okay, so at that particular IP address we have a Google server which is active 24/7. Okay, now what will happen, the moment that server will encounter a request, so it will just search for a particular page that the user is demanding for, and in response to that request the Google server will send a response back to the client. Okay, so the request was made to the Google server which was present at a particular IP address, and that IP address was decoded by the DNS server. Okay, after decoding the IP address, after sending the request to that particular server which is present at the IP address, the server will respond back with a response or with a particular page that the client has demanded for. Okay, so this is how exactly a request is made by the client and it reaches to the Google server. Okay, now you must be wondering how the request is sent from client to server and how the response is sent back from server to client. Okay, so in order to answer this question, let's go to this website which is called as submarinecablemap.com. Okay, so what actually happens is inside the oceans we have different types of cables. Okay, so for example, let's say, okay, let me just zoom out a little bit. Okay, so let's say for example we have a client which is sitting at Spain. Okay, and this client wants to send a request to a particular server which is present at Colombia. Okay, so what will happen, the client will send a request. Okay, the client will just go to his browser, he will just type the name of the website or the page that he wants to see. Okay, and after that the DNS server will find out the corresponding IP address. Okay, and after that, after fetching or after finding out the IP address, the client will directly send the request to the IP address that the DNS server has encoded. Okay, so after the client makes a request, that request will go all the way around to these fibers that are present inside the ocean, and it will reach to the Colombia. Okay, and in response to that, the server will send the page that the client has demanded, and that response will again go all the way back to these cables, and it will reach the Spain where the client is actually present. So this is how internet actually works, and I hope it's clear to you. So that was all for this particular video, and we'll see you in the next one.